Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan has had a distinguished career as a Singaporean diplomat and a civil servant. He's held many important posts, including, of course, Singapore's ambassador to the Russian Federation, permanent representative to the United Nations, and recently the last position officially as ambassador at large. Currently, Ambassador Kausikan is chairman of the Middle East Institute, which is an autonomous institute of the National University of Singapore. So you can see all of these incredible jobs that he's had. I hope all of you follow him on Facebook. He lists himself as a pensioner. From the perspective of an American, Ambassador Bilahari has always been the best person in Southeast Asia to turn to for insights on a broad range of issues, including developments in ASEAN, trends in the broader Asia-Pacific region, and, of course, American policy. And he's often provided his critique of U.S. policy, whether or not we in Washington wanted to hear it. Now, to my mind, that is the value of a true friend. And I know many of my countrymen who agree with me. So I thank you, Bilahari, for your advice and your criticism, and hope you will continue to give it. So today we're looking forward to your remarks on Chinese public diplomacy in East Asia and the Pacific, and I hope you all join me in welcoming Ambassador Bilahari.
Thanks, Bonnie. That was far too kind an introduction, which raises expectations I certainly am not going to be able to fulfill. However, I'm glad she did provide me with an alibi by saying that I have just come back this morning from Azerbaijan. So if I am much more incoherent than I usually am, you know why. Anyway, let me get to it. I've been asked to speak about Chinese public diplomacy in the Asia Pacific. And I take it by public diplomacy, you really mean influence operations, but I'll be polite to say so. Yes. In any case, whether you mean it or not, that's what I'm going to talk about. Let me make some general remarks first about influence operations. There are two broad categories of such operations. First of all, of course, legitimate diplomacy, whether it's public or secret diplomacy. And of course, there are covert operations, which are generally illegal, whether they are, the deployment of agents of influence in the classic sense, or different types of operations to suborn decision makers or public opinion shapers. And within these two broad categories, there are three general techniques, whether the modality is legitimate or covert. And these are, of course, persuasion, inducement, and coercion. Now, nothing I've said so far is unique to China. All major countries deploy both legitimate and covert operations and employ all three techniques in pursuit of influence. And the US is certainly not virginally pure in this respect, except you're usually much more self-righteous about it and call influence operations democracy promotion or something like that. Now, I'm going to focus in very broad sketches on what I think is uniquely Chinese about such operations. And I think what is unique to China comes from three interrelated factors. First, the nature of the Chinese state. Second, its holistic approach, which melds together the legal and the covert, and the persuasion, inducement, and coercion. And thirdly, the aim of such operations, which is not just to direct behavior, but to condition behavior. In other words, China does not just want you to comply with its wishes. Far more fundamentally, it wants you to think in such a way that you will, of your own volition, do what it wants without being told. It's a form of psychological manipulation. Let me deal with these three factors in turn. As a state, China has three identities. First of all, it is a state like any other state, a Westphalian state, if you like, operating like any other state. Secondly, it is a Leninist state. Well, communist ideology in its classic sense is no longer very relevant to contemporary China, but the structures that derive from that ideology, in particular the idea of an elite leading party that dominates and directs all other institutions, and to which the state and society is subordinate, is still very relevant and has become much more so under President Xi Jinping. And thirdly, China is a civilizational state. The embodiment and exemplar of millennia of Chinese culture and history, now rejuvenated under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi Jinping. Now, each identity has its own characteristic modus operandi, which, while they are conceptually and operationally separate and distinct, are nonetheless interrelated and mutually reinforcing. And again, let me deal with them in turn. Now, a Westphalian state, as a Westphalian state, China, like all states, conducts relationships at the state-to-state level through the usual instruments of diplomacy that deploys as appropriate all three techniques: persuasion, inducement, and coercion. Because diplomacy, as I keep reminding, I used to remind my young officers in MFA, is not just about being nice or pleasant or agreeable for any country. State-to-state relationships naturally fluctuate up and down. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they're not so good, because no relationship in the world ever unfolds over a smooth trajectory, except irrelevant relationships, and China, of course, is never irrelevant. And state-to-state relationships, at least in principle, but not always in practice, are conducted in accordance with Westphalian norms. A Leninist state. The characteristic modus operandi of a Leninist state is what Mao Zedong called the magic weapon of the United Front. There is a United Front Work Department under the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. And United Front work in China is largely domestic. That's its main focus. But has an international dimension. In fact, the very point of United Front work is, in my view, to blur the distinction between the domestic and international and promote the party's interests wherever it may be, domestic or international. And in this sense, it represents a rejection or a negation of the Westphalian norm of non-interference in internal affairs, which is enshrined in Article 41 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Now, for every country, this norm of non-interference is often breached in practice, by at least respected in principle. But United Front work is an explicit rejection of this principle, the party's interests being paramount. The United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party has been considerably strengthened under President Xi Jinping. And thirdly, China as a civilizational state. And the characteristic modus operandi in this identity of China operates through the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. The aim, which has been more insistently asserted under President Xi Jinping, has been neatly encapsulated by the title of a speech he gave in 2014 to the 7th Conference of Overseas Chinese Associations. And the title reads as follows: The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is a dream shared by all Chinese. All Chinese. In plain language, overseas Chinese should identify the interests with Chinese interests. That's not the only speech. I'll give you just one more example. If you just look online, you can find many other examples. In January this year, at the National Overseas Chinese Conference, the former State Councillor and now Politburo member Yang Jiechi called upon the government to expand and strengthen what he called overseas Chinese patriotic friendly forces in the service of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And again, the message was clear. Identify your interests, make sure they identify their interests with China's interests. Now, in March this year, the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office was incorporated into the United Front Work Department. You can't get any clearer, more open and transparent than that. Who says China is an opaque society? Now, these characteristic modes of operation prescribe 3 tracks on which China conducts its international relations. They are separate but interrelated, and they all pursue the same goals: China's interests and promote Chinese influence, though not necessarily by the same means or technique. And this creates a very powerful because flexible instrument for advancing Chinese influence, which can be difficult to deal with because it is so flexible. For example, just give you an example, theoretical example. On the first track of state-to-state relations, maybe the main technique is coercion. As I said, coercion is part of diplomacy for every country. On the second track, however, it may be inducement. And on the third track, it may be, persuasion, or any combination you might imagine. And as I said, this creates a very powerful because very flexible instrument, which can be hard to deal with. Why is it hard to deal with? Because the natural tendency of all governments, or at least all foreign ministries, is to focus on the first track of state-to-state relations and to want to keep relations at that track on an even keel, not to rock the boat. And this can very easily lead, perhaps even unconsciously, to overlooking or downplaying what is happening on the other 2 tracks. I mentioned that this is really a form of psychological manipulation or psychological operation. Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategist, among other things, said, what did he say? I can't read my handwriting. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. The overall objective of the deployment of the 3 tracks in whatever combination of persuasion, inducement, or coercion is to create a psychological environment that facilitates the deployment of and accentuates the efficacy of China's most insistent tactic. And this tactic is simply to pose false choices and to force choices between false choices. It sounds simple, but it can be a very powerful technique. It is simple, but often extremely effective. And it's used, and this technique of forcing false choices on you and making you choose between false choices is deployed within the framework of either overarching narratives or specific narratives specific to a country or specific to a particular issue. And the purpose of these narratives is to narrow the scope of choices, and they are usually presented in binary terms, and the intention is to, as it were, stampede your mind, stampede your thinking, so that the critical faculty is not fully engaged, and to instill a sense of fatalistic inevitability about the choices forced upon you. Let me give you some examples of these narratives. First, let me give you some examples of the overarching grand narratives that are commonly used. And I'm paraphrasing them. In the exact language, there are many forms. I'm paraphrasing the main ideas of these grand narratives. One is, for example, America is the past, China is the future, so get on the right side of history. And the Belt and Road is many things, but among other things, it's part of this kind of narrative. Another one is, America is inconsistent, but China is a geographic fact. in this region, and therefore will always be here. So again, get on the right side of history. Choose wisely. Another is, being close to America makes it difficult to have a close economic relationship with China. Let me give you some examples of specific narratives, which are either specific to issues or specific to countries. And here I take them mainly from narratives that were deployed against Singapore in the last couple of years. First, one specific narrative to a particular issue is on the South China Sea. Singapore has no claims in the South China Sea, so why is the Singapore government taking sides against China? Another one was, relations were much better under Lee Kuan Yew because he understood China in a way that the present Singapore leadership does not understand China. And the third one is, Singapore is a small country and should not take sides against China. Now these narratives, whether of the overarching type or of the more specific type, are quite powerful because they are not entirely fabrications. They do contain a kernel of truth. They are not made up. They are only either extremely simplistic, so as to be gross distortions of much more complex realities, or leave out vital facts. I'll give you one example. This idea that Singapore had a much better relationship under Lee Kuan Yew because he understood China much better than the present leadership. Well, it leaves out one vital fact. As far as I can find, Lee Kuan Yew is the only non-communist leader that ever went into a Chinese-supported United Front and won. And that drew a red line on which the relationship developed. That is never part of the narrative. It's a very inconvenient fact. And here, if I may be permitted a slight digression, I think, it's clear Mr. Trump's unpredictability and so on does not help in these narratives. But at the same time, I have been telling, ever since Mr. Trump was elected, been telling my American friends, including you, Bonnie, that it's not as if every damn thing he does is wrong. And if that narrative comes across because of your shock and emotional upset at being elected and certain things he does, he plays into these narratives. I have for more than 30 years, coming 40 years, telling American friends, do not believe that everybody in this part of the world understands your weird and wonderful political system as well as you fondly believe they do. They might just take you far more seriously than warranted. Absolutely failure in convincing them it is so. Well, these narratives are propagated by a variety of means. More recently, in Singapore's case, through social media, WeChat and other things, spread by word of mouth, and reinforced by actions, such as undertaken in the South China Sea, such as the seizure of our armored personnel vehicles in January last year. And that is an example of a holistic approach which I spoke of in the beginning. And of course, part of that holistic approach is the traditional overt means of propagating influence through classical agents of influence. And in August 2017, a Chinese academic by the name of Wang Jing, who was at the Lee Kuan Yew School for Public Policy, was expelled from Singapore for being the agent of influence of a foreign country who cooperated with the intelligence organizations of that foreign country to try to influence the Singapore government's foreign policy and public opinion in Singapore. Now, we didn't name the foreign country, and I had long retired since then, so I have no privileged information. I only laid 4 facts. A few facts before you. Wang Jing had dual US and PRC citizenship. Dual citizenship is not permitted under PRC law. Wang Jing is now reported to be holding a senior academic position in Chengdu, in China. And, a little anecdote. not too long after Huan Ding's expulsion, a senior Singapore Chinese businessman with extensive interest in China, whom I had a passing acquaintance with, but whom I had no direct dealings with for a decade or more, out of the blue called me and asked me to lunch. And he spent the entire lunch trying to persuade me, telling me how patriotic a Singaporean he was. The guilty flee and no man pursued. The point of me telling you the episode is that it wouldn't do to underestimate the effectiveness of these operations. But at the same time, I don't want to leave you with the impression that they are unstoppable or invincible either. In fact, I think what I have described to you, these kind of operations that I've described to you, suffer from three critical vulnerabilities. First, what I call cultural altruism. Second, a tendency towards self-deception and therefore rigidity, which is probably the consequence of the Leninist state, which has become more pronounced under Xi Jinping. And again, a consequence of that, a tendency sometimes to overreach. Now, a good example of these first two vulnerabilities there are Chinese operations among overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. Now, this brings anybody, even with a passing acquaintance of the history and politics of this region, China into some extremely sensitive territory. Dangerous, in fact. Now, many decades ago, China, in 1955 to be more precise, China made a distinction between the Huaqiao and the Huaran, PRC citizens and ethnic Chinese living overseas who may be citizens of other countries or stateless or something like that. And it was a sensible distinction to be made because of the very sensitivity of the position of overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia and the possible downside of emphasizing China's connection with these communities. Now, the two quotations I gave you from Xi Jinping's speech and Yang Jiechi, and the underlying message that overseas Chinese should identify their interests with China, reinforced by the actions of Chinese diplomats, some Chinese diplomats in this region, has the effect of blurring that distinction between the Huaqiao and the Huaran. And it's a deliberate blurring. And I'll give you just one example. During the last general election, the Chinese ambassador to Malaysia went to campaign for a Chinese political party, the leader of the Chinese political party in his constituency. Now, that was so incredibly stupid that when some Malaysian friends told me about it, I didn't believe them, and I went to check. And everybody I checked with said, yes, it is true. But it is so incredibly, absurdly stupid. Why? Well, I think there's a certain element of cultural altruism in it, and there's a certain element of self-deception. How could he possibly think this was a good idea? Well, I can only understand it maybe partially by saying that once the big man has decided this is a jolly good idea, who is going to tell him it is actually a stupid idea? And if any of you who have worked in bureaucracies know that there is a dynamic that when orders are instructed from the top, issued from the top, any bureaucracy, it doesn't have to be a bureaucracy of a Leninist state, though that accentuates the problem. There is a tendency as that order is passed down for people to add salt, pepper, chili sauce, ketchup, as it goes down to prove how zealous and patriotic you are. Well, I don't want to give you more examples, we can talk about it later, but there are other examples. In Laos, Laos is another Leninist state. Another Leninist state, but in 2016 at the Lao Party Congress, they threw out a few people, including a Politburo member and a deputy prime minister, and who was also foreign minister, for being reportedly too pro-Chinese. The guy was also ethnic Chinese. And this kind of discomfort in a region where the position of the overseas Chinese is always going to be very sensitive is the result of those two vulnerabilities, this cultural altruism and this tendency towards self-deception, which arises from the character of a Leninist state, or is accentuated. Okay? And there's been pushback, even though people do not, it may be sometimes under the surface, but there's been pushback. If you travel throughout Southeast Asia, you will hear many anecdotes for pushback. And as Bonnie said, I've just come back from Azerbaijan, and since I retired, I've been traveling quite a lot in Central Asia, and I find a very similar phenomenon in almost every country there. You can find that kind of phenomenon or that kind of pushback in almost any region of the world. I'm not saying that means that these relationships are going to fall apart, but it means that there is this undercurrent which makes them, in my mind, somewhat brittle. And it's not just confined to this area, the kind of Belt and Road projects and things like that. And you see what's happened in Malaysia. There's some reevaluation. I don't think they're going to reject a relationship with China, but they will certainly reevaluate. In other areas, for example, I am increasingly convinced, and my American friends tell me I am wrong or not, that with all these trade troubles between US and China, I think one factor, not the only factor, but one factor is the Chinese really, through a form of self-deception, which maybe arises from a similar dynamic, badly underestimate the depth of resentment that has been building up in American businesses over many years, and over the theft of technology, intellectual property rights, and so on. And they are a bit shocked. Now, my point is not, let me emphasize, it's not that Chinese operations will, left to themselves, inevitably fail of their own weight. That's not my point. My point is that there is nothing inevitable one way or the other about whether they will succeed or whether they will fail. And even if they succeed, they can be brittle. Chinese influence can be brittle. And that leads to me to the third vulnerability of such operations. Remember, the first vulnerability was what I call cultural altruism. Second vulnerability is a tendency towards self-deception. The third vulnerability is perhaps the most critical. Such operations depend on the targets being unconscious that such operations are being conducted. Once the target is aware of being psychologically manipulated, the efficacy of such manipulation is greatly compromised, because the efficacy of such operations depends in large part on the sense of fatalistic inevitability that those narratives present you, the false choices, or resistance being futile. But once you are aware, then you have to be particularly obtuse to fall for them. And people in this part of the world, as I keep telling my American friends, we may look stupid, but we are not really all that stupid. At least not all the time. Of course, even when exposed, some targets may play along. Maybe because they are genuinely sympathetic to some Chinese interests, maybe because of cultural affinity, and we should not underestimate the effect of chauvinism, or maybe for purely transactional reasons, for hope of reward or fear of sanction. But if that is so, if they are exposed and the influence is based on these very transactional issues, that is a qualitatively different situation from being subject to unconscious psychological manipulation. Because influence, in this case, is apt to be brittle. As the US ought to know. You ought to know that when people agree with you about democracy and human rights, sometimes it is purely for transactional reasons, and they have no real intention of doing as you want them to behave. You have had many examples in your own diplomatic history in this region. I need not belabor the point. What is the point? The point is exposure is therefore the best countermeasure. And exposure not just of particular operations, such as has occurred in, say, Australia or New Zealand, but more generally of the modus operandi of psychological manipulation that I've been trying to describe. And of its vulnerabilities, which I have quickly listed, in order to destroy, in order to undermine the aura of inevitability on which such operations depend. Now, there are good reasons why governments often, perhaps too often, find it difficult to undertake exposure of this kind. I mentioned the main reason. As a matter of policy, unless China goes too far, and even then, controversy often arises because political interests in democratic or at least pluralistic societies are never unidimensional. Political office holders and even senior civil servants are inevitably pulled in different directions and thus constrained, because people want to focus on the first track, keep that on an even keel. And so gatherings of this kind play a very important role in exposure. And I conclude by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this effort to let sunlight into darkness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Bilahari. Lots of great insights and excellent examples. We have a saying that we often use in the discussion of this topic, as well as others, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So it's shining a light on activities and enhancing awareness of them. And so I agree with you. That is, I think, one of the main purposes of the A-Data report, is to bring to light many of the activities that have been taking place and encouraging discussion of them here. And that's certainly what we're trying to do here, and we hope the report will be read globally and will stimulate discussion in many, many countries. So we have, I think, about just a little bit under 20 minutes. And so I'd like to give maybe the audience the opportunity to ask some questions. So if you want to come up to the microphone, you can pose some questions. Don't be shy.
Today is Wednesday, I only buy on Thursdays. So.
That's right. Okay, John, please.
Thank you for the fantastic presentation. My question is, what sorts of states do you think are most vulnerable to Chinese interference operations in the long term? You talked about some wilderness states, you talked about some democracies, you talked about Singapore. Are there, what sort of former states do you think are at least equipped to repel interference operations and to neutralise them with sunlight?
Best or worse? Okay, I mean, it's the same question in different ways. In fact, I was asked this question in Central Asia not so long ago, and my answer is simple. Corrupt states are most vulnerable. Singapore is a slightly special case because the majority of population is Chinese, but we are not corrupt, so it kind of balances off. But the simple answer is corrupt states, states where there are failures of governance, which normally boils down to corruption.
I just ask you to extrapolate a little bit. What does that tell you about the future of Southeast Asia and Europe?
Yeah, but even the most corrupt state is not without its own nationalism, you know. I gave the example of Laos. Laos is not a squeaky clean state, but Laos are nationalists and they don't have much room to take, but what room they have, they take.
One of the points that you made is that every country that uses public diplomacy, or indeed diplomacy of any kind, combines coercion, inducement, and persuasion. But I wonder if you could talk a bit about whether you think that balance is very different in the case of China, or the way that they connect with each other. So do you think that the way we were talking earlier about financing, for example, for Belt and Road type projects. So that could be seen, of course, as an inducement, but it could also be combined with a sort of threat of coercion. So if you don't in some way modify the behavior of a state, then you don't get the inducement, and indeed you may get some punishment. So do you think the way that China combines these three tools is different than the way other countries do, or you think it's really not unique?
I think it is unique in what I said it is, in the very systematic, consistent way it takes a holistic approach. Not just between these three techniques, but between the covert and the legitimate, in a general, to create that kind of psychological environment which I described. Let me just, I forgot to make a point in the answer to the first question. I'll come back to this. You asked about Southeast Asia. I just ask you to think of two things. Southeast Asia is a diverse region, it's a complicated region. There is no country, major power, that has ever been able to grasp Southeast Asia whole, except for a very short period of Japanese occupation during the Second World War, and that didn't end very well for the Japanese. Some time ago, a Japanese friend was bewailing the fact to me that Japan had lost the Bandung-Jakarta high-speed rail to China, and he claimed it was due to corruption. I said, I don't know whether it's due to corruption, but I told him, be of good cheer, you will thank the Indonesians for giving it to China. And true, 2 years on, nothing has happened. Land even hasn't been acquired. I told a Chinese friend, in a slightly different, similar but slightly different context, that look, you've got to understand, Indonesia is a big country like you. It is not as ancient a country as you, but ancient enough. And they have a grand and proud tradition of taking money from every major power and doing as they please. Coming back to the point I made about Southeast Asia being diverse and no country ever being able to grasp it all. The natural instinct of all Southeast Asian countries is to bandwagon, hedge, and balance simultaneously. We don't see these things as alternatives. The mixture may vary from issue to issue over time, but all these three elements are never totally absent. And don't forget, in Southeast Asia, I come back to Indonesia. Indonesia is a big country, and part of its national identity is to have a bebas and active, free and active foreign policy. It's not going to allow itself to be captured by anybody. Vietnam is Vietnam. Because over 2 millennia, it refused to subordinate itself to a Chinese regional order. If you extrapolate that, for Japan, ever since in the 16th century, Hideyoshi unified Japan after a very long civil war, what's the first thing he did? He went and invaded Korea in defiance of the Chinese world order of that time. In other words, not being China and not subordinating itself to China is a core element of Japanese identity. Ditto for Korea. You look at whether north or south, the same. A core element of Korean identity, whether north or south, is not to accept permanent subordination to a Chinese order. For Singapore, it is an existential issue. When China tries to impose the Chinese identity of Singapore, we must resist, because modern Singapore is not based on being a Chinese country. It's based on being a multiracial country. So I don't think it's going to be a smooth ride. As a big country, contiguous to Southeast Asia, as a huge economy, China is always going to enjoy significant influence in this entire region. Nobody can ignore China. But significant influence is not dominant influence, nor is it exclusive influence.
Anyone else have a question? Yes, please.
Peter Lim, RTIS.
Speak louder, please, into the microphone.
Sorry. The pensioners speak speaks with a much bigger, as I've known over the decades. So what's your secret?
Bourbon.
It's not a secret.
Okay. My question is, what is Singapore's core? You talk about the core strength, right? The wrong word, that makes immense core
I
strength.
get what you mean. I get what you mean.
So, the rest of the question is this. A lot of people are saying that China is upset with us, and I don't agree with that point of view, because we are too friendly with and too dependent on the Americans. Why don't we be more equidistant between these two, the dominant world power that may not so dominant anymore, and the rising China. So do we need to be, I suppose, as a Singaporean, I don't think we need to be less friendly with America, but are we in a bind?
Okay, you actually have two questions, huh?
Sorry.
I think the core of Singapore, and that is why when Chinese try to impose a Chinese identity on us, we must resist as a matter of existential necessity, is this idea of being a multiracial country. That is what I would call a horizontal organizing principle. Almost every country in this region is organized vertically, either explicit or implicitly, on the basis of a vertical ethnic hierarchy. That is true from Japan, a liberal democracy. It's true of China. It's true of Malaysia in the constitution. You know, you name it, you can find it. In America, I mean, one of the meanings of the Trump phenomenon, or in the right-wing movements in Europe, is to try to impose a white Christian identity on what is actually a horizontally organized society. Now, as for your second question, I think it is wrong to think that we side with China or we side with America. We side only with Singapore. The organizing idea is our own national interest. Sometimes it may lead us to tilt a bit towards China on some issues. Sometimes it may lead us to tilt towards America on some issues. But the guiding principle is always our own interest. Yes, I've heard what you have heard. That's part of these narratives that will be propagated, not without success. Because most Singaporeans are not bloody interested in foreign policy. Right? Most people in any country are not interested in foreign policy, and that creates very fertile ground for this kind of operations. And that is an issue, that is a problem that needs to be addressed in different ways in different countries. But I have heard the other narrative. I have heard Chinese telling me, both before I retired and after I retired, you are too close to America. I have heard Americans telling me, both before I retired and after I retired, you are too close to China. And my answer to them is, if you think I'm too close to B, and if he thinks I'm too close to A, we must be doing something right. That is pursuing our national interests.
What is the advice that you give your government?
I'm so sorry, can I ask a follow-up question?
He used to be a journalist, so there's always a follow-up.
With the South China Sea problem with China carrying on, no, I don't think there's an early solution on the horizon. Does the fact, or not the fact, does the narrative that says we have an American naval base in Singapore because our naval base is so big, much bigger than our ships need, our own naval ships mean that physically, visually, we are on the other side where China Sea moves are concerned.
Oh no, I mean, you know we have pursued our interests. We are not a claimant state, but we have our own interests. Yeah, Changi Naval Base was built for the operations of many countries. I've often told Chinese friends, and I do have some, still. Look, a semi-aircraft carrier, but alongside the American aircraft carrier, it is open to any country. mean, don't birth alongside if you're trying to destroy us, you know. But you know, I mean, American ships use it, Indian ships use it, Japanese ships use it. For Christ's sake, even Chilean ships have used it. Any country, Chinese ships are welcome to use it. They don't use it very much. I don't know why, but that's their choice, not ours. Now, the South China Sea as a whole is pretty much a stalemate. I've written about this many times, so I'll be very brief for those who have not heard my view on this. It is a stalemate at the strategic level. Nobody is going to make, not the United States, not anybody is going to make China dig up those artificial islands it has constructed. Nobody's going to stop China deploying military assets on it. But by the same token, China cannot stop the US and its allies operating in, through, over, under the South China Sea. And the USS Ronald Reagan had just passed through. It's pretty much a stalemate, and that is not an ideal situation, but for countries like us, it's good enough situation because it preserves maneuver space for the smaller countries of the region. You can't stop. America doesn't want to risk war, and it'll mean war if you try to get China off those islands. China can't stop the Americans from operating the South China Sea without risking war. Nobody wants war, so it's a stalemate. And that is the situation. If there is a war, those islands and the assets on them are only targets. Everybody knows that. And that's not the purpose. The purpose are for these psychological operations and for domestic consumption in China.
All right, we're going to ask the last two questions together. One will be Peter Mattis's question, and then I have a question, okay? And then we have one more, and then we'll have to close at that so that we can set up for the next panel. Peter?
You mentioned that China methods only work if the society and government is unconscious, in your words. But what are the tools of transparency both for governments and for civil society outside with which to provide transparency or provide the wake up?
Oh, shall we take them all?
Yes.
Actually, it's pretty much the same as what Peter has asked. What can be done as a country to develop psychological resilience against things like conditioning effect of Chinese kind of influence, and also develop consciousness so that we know how to deal with it when the time comes.
And my question is about what your advice is to your government, other governments inside and outside the region, about how to respond to what you, I think, very correctly describe as Chinese narratives. So if the Chinese say the United States is not reliable, the US will remain in Asia, China's geographically here, or the United States is in decline, China's on the rise, of course you should accommodate Chinese interests. What is the best way for governments to respond to these kinds of narratives, both internally as well as responding to China?
Okay, that's a subset of the other two questions, basically what can be done, right? What can be done is that sometimes we have to draw red lines and enforce them when they go too far, as they did in Australia and as it can be speculated they did in Singapore. Secondly, what I said, that you have to create public consciousness that such operations do occur. It's simple to say, hard to do in practice, because it has to be done fairly consistently. Now, the second question, I think the answer will vary from country to country. In Singapore, one particular problem we have is that we do a really bad job of national education. The best national education on this issue, this specific issue, occurred when China tried to steal our armored personnel carriers. When you try to explain the South China Sea to the average Singaporean, eyes glaze over. Talk about law of the sea, UNCLOS, this and that to understand, and you kind of lose the battle of narratives. But by God, you stole my stuff. Everybody can understand. In fact, it sounds better in Hokkien because Singaporeans will know what I meant. something, you stole my stuff, right? Even the principal member of opposition felt obliged to stand up in Parliament and say this is wrong. Right? So the best national education is events, but I'm not suggesting that we should create a crisis with China just for national education purposes. Nor do I suggest we should create a crisis with America for national education purposes, because as I said, the United States is not virginally pure on this matter either. All right. One other thing we can do in Singapore is do national education, and in particular teach our own history better. Because we don't teach our own history well, there is a lacuna in public understanding which is often filled with a whole lot of rubbish by attention-seeking quasi-academics who, for example, denied that there was ever such thing as a united front operating in Malaya and Singapore. For your question, Bonnie, I don't know actually that there is a perfect solution, because for too long America did a really bad job of telling its own story, because you thought there was no need to tell a story because by yourself you are the exemplar, the shining example, a shining city on the hill. So everybody should see it. If you don't see it, you are just obtuse or malevolent, right? You should learn to tell the story better. Add complexity, and this actually applies to everybody, to simplistic narratives. One thing you can do, and I must say, as I said, I'll repeat what I said just now. Mr. Trump doesn't help, that is clear. But it is not as if every damn thing he does is wrong. And you should, in your own criticisms of Mr. Trump, add that complexity. And not just have the simpler narrative that every damn thing he does is wrong. Many things he does is wrong, but many things he does is not so wrong. Some are better than his predecessors, and there's as much continuity, at least in the foreign policy and security field, as there has been disruption.
Excellent advice. You have not disappointed in the least, even though I know you're jet-lagged. So I want to really thank you for coming to speak to us today. Please join me in thanking Ambassador.